Well, good evening. It's wonderful to be here. I know you read a short paper for this, but my presentation is going to be related but slightly different. And what I want to do in the initial discussion is just provide you with some background. And then this paper is kind of an extension of this idea. But by giving you this background, I'll provide you with, hopefully, with a broader theoretical basis that you can take away, not just in terms of this paper, but in anything else in your other classes, but also in understanding the world in general. And this is the notion of interventionism, or what's called the dynamics of interventionism. So this comes out of the Austrian School of Economics, this idea of the dynamics of interventionism. And here are basically the three main pieces of literature. Ludwig von Mises had something called The Theory of Money and Credit, where he developed the Austrian business cycle. A Critique of Interventionism and Human Action, those three books. Murray Rothbard, in his book Power and Market, which is the third volume of Man, Economy, and State, he discusses the dynamics of intervention in there. And then more recently, Sandy Akita has a book called Dynamics of the Mixed Economy. So that's kind of what I'm pulling on to talk to you about this. Now here's the way to think about the dynamics of interventionism. You all know unintended consequences, right? And so here's an example of unintended consequences, which you all learned very early on in your economics career. It's just the basic price control, right? So if this is the basic supply and demand, and here's the starting points, and then a price control is imposed that's below the equilibrium price, we all know what happens, which is the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and there's a shortage, right? This is just the standard logic of price controls. We call this, so we call this shortage an unintended consequence of the price control. Let's say this is a rent control. The idea is to basically lower the rent, the price of rental property for people to help them. That's the intention of it. But we point out, economists point out, that one of the unintended consequences of doing this is that it leads to a shortage, okay? That's usually where it stops, right? So when your professors went through this or you read about it, that's usually where the argument stops. The dynamics of interventionism, the way to think about it, that Mises, Rothbard, and Akita developed, was this logic as a starting point plus subsequent steps. So it's basically if you continued the reasoning of what happened after the shortage got generated, that would be the dynamics of interventionism. So really the way to think about this is a way of analyzing government intervention. That's the first thing to think about. It's an extension of a lot of the things you've been talking about in your classes throughout your academic career. The market process is the notion of how the market basically moves towards equilibrium. The entrepreneur, of course, is the driver of that. This notion of economic calculation, just to refresh your memory, economic calculation is the idea that came out of Mises during the calculation debate. And calculation is basically the ability of entrepreneurs to judge opportunity cost. All right, so the issue, of course, was that there are lots of technologically feasible projects that we can undertake. Okay, we have scarce resources, and there's lots of things we could do with them that are all technologically feasible. With the wood from this table, we could have built this table, we could have built a house, we could have done lots of things with it. We could have burned it in a fire. There's lots of different things we could have done with it. What we need to do is figure out a means or a mechanism for determining how to allocate scarce resources. And what Mises pointed out was that rational economic calculation was the way to do that. Rational economic calculation was only possible under private property because private property generated markets, which in turn generated prices. And the importance of prices are that prices capture opportunity cost. Right? That's why we like prices as economists. Of course, most people tend to think of prices as absolute prices. So if this bottle of water is $1, they tend to think of it as being $1. But really, what does that mean? It's capturing the opportunity cost, right? If this bottle of water is $1 and this marker costs 50 cents, every bottle of water I buy costs 2 markers, right? That's basically the trade-off. It's the opportunity cost. Prices capture that. They capture the trade-off between various resources. So you can know what you're giving up when you're purchasing something. Entrepreneurs can use this because they can gauge if they're using resources into their best alternative, right? Because they know, because if they are misusing it, it will be represented by a higher price. That's a signal that you shouldn't pursue that course of action, or you should pursue less of it because the price is higher relative to other alternatives. This is going to be an extension of that. And the knowledge problem, which is directly related to the calculation argument. Of course, the knowledge problem came out of Hayek in his 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And what Hayek was talking about in that paper is how markets contain context-specific knowledge of time and place that allows people to then trade and engage in interactions. And no central planner or group of planners can possibly possess that information outside of the market. So really, the dynamics of intervention is an extension of this. All right, it's an extension of this logic. And basically what it's doing is showing how the calculation argument can be pushed beyond the standard socialist calculation debate. Okay, so the calculation argument arose in the context of socialism. So in the early 1900s, basically there's a group of economists who started arguing that socialism was the best means of organizing economic activity. And their argument was that centrally planning the economy, in other words, abolishing private property and having experts allocate resources, would outproduce capitalism, so it would produce more wealth, and it would overcome all the bad parts of capitalism: unemployment, inequality, business cycles, and so on. Okay, so you'd have the best of all worlds. You'd have more output, and you'd overcome all those downturns. And what Mises and Hayek showed during the calculation debate was that that was impossible, or that socialism was impossible. In other words, the stated ends were impossible because planners couldn't do what they thought they could do. So basically, the dynamics of intervention extends this logic beyond socialism to talk about a mixed economy, where government tries to, because what happened after the socialist loss, socialism didn't go by the wayside. What happened then was that something arose called the third way. So they said, okay, we can't centrally plan markets, but here's what we can do. We can allow for markets, but then we can intervene in those markets to fine-tune them and to address things that we see as being problematic. And then we can still have the best of all worlds. We could have markets, because we've shown that markets work better than socialism, but we can have a group of experts who intervene to fix perceived problems. But it still suffers from the exact same problems that Mises and Hayek pointed out. It's just a variation of them. And as I mentioned, the dynamics of intervention goes beyond the standard unintended consequences. The price control argument that you all learned in basic economics is an unintended consequence story. And as I mentioned, the dynamics of intervention go beyond that. So think of it as kind of unintended consequences plus some more bad stuff. And I'll talk about what that is momentarily. So let's talk about what the dynamics of intervention is. It's basically a sequence of adjustments resulting from an intervention. So government intervenes in the economy or in social life, and what they're trying to do is fix something. They're trying to make it better from their state of affairs, what they perceive to be a better state of affairs. And basically what happens is you get a sequence of events. In other words, when government intervenes, it changes the incentives that people face, and you get a change then in behavior, right? In other words, interventions are not neutral. It's not like government intervenes and you and I don't change our behavior. A simple example of this, an extreme example, but a simple example is the following. Oftentimes governments like to talk about increasing taxes on wealthy people because they say they can afford it. Well, if that's true, right, why doesn't government increase taxes on wealthy people to 100%, right? Well, they could afford it. You take away all their money. And the reason they wouldn't do that, and we all recognize this, is that there'd be no incentive to be wealthy anymore, right? That basically illustrates my point about the non-neutrality of interventions. It shifts incentives. Okay, and I realize, again, that's an extreme example, but I'm trying to show the point. But even if you increase taxes, by the way, by 2%, it changes people's behavior on the margin, right? And marginal analysis is what we care about as economists. So here's what interventionism is. Intervention, as I mentioned, is this doctrine based on the power of government to intervene in markets and fix things. That's basically what it is. It results in a mixed economy. So you don't have pure capitalism, you don't have pure socialism, you have a third way. All right, and again, the idea of this third way was that you could have the best of both extremes. You could allow markets to operate, but also fix the problems. You could fix things like social justice issues, whereby the wealthy had more, or somehow engaged in exploitation, so you could take from them and redistribute to the poor. You could address issues of the business cycle, right? When the Federal Reserve, for instance, intervenes in the American economy, we were talking earlier today in another session about how that has spillover effects throughout the world now, because everything's so interconnected. But when they intervene, really what they're trying to do is this kind of logic, right? They're saying, we like markets, but the outcome that's being generated is not something we prefer. We think we can fix it by intervening and make it better. So we're going to tweak markets by injecting money into it or by changing interest rates. And basically what you get is a mixed economy then between the two extremes. And really what the dynamics of interventionism allows us to do is analyze what happens when government does this. So what are the presumptions of interventionism? What do they presume? Well, it's pretty straightforward. They presume that a group of experts can intervene and fix things, can make them better off. Right? Rarely, if ever, at least do politicians come out and say we're intervening to make people worse off. They always claim, at least, and we don't know their true intentions, but we can assume, at least, as economists at least, we have to assume that they're attempting to make things better off from their own standpoint. So again, the basic example I put up here, someone in government observes in New York City that rent is high. Right? There's lots of rent-controlled apartments in New York City. And so basically what happens is they say, okay, rent's high in New York City, that's unfair to people that can't afford it. Right? It's not fair that only the wealthy people get to live in New York City. So they come in and they block off certain apartment buildings and they say these are rent-controlled buildings. Right? And the rent is significantly below the market rate. Okay? From their standpoint, they're helping poor people. Same as like the minimum wage type logic. The question is, and what economics allows us to analyze, is what happens when you do that, when you intervene to help people, and then what are the subsequent effects of that. Okay, so the first is that the government or experts can identify problems and then can identify a way to fix them. That's the knowledge problem, basically the issue of knowledge or assuming knowledge. The government has the knowledge to do it. The second is this issue of political economy. The second assumption is that the interventions are free from political influence. In other words, you and I can sit in this room, identify a problem, identify a solution, and then implement that solution without any kind of political influence changing it. Okay, those are the two assumptions that implicitly are made. So let's talk about what the dynamics of interventionism actually are. In order to understand this, you have to understand basically Austrian political economy, okay, Austrian political economy, which comes directly out of Austrian economics. And here's basically the two main aspects of this. The first is this notion of the Austrian notion of the market process. Now, where I'm sure you learned economics with the basic supply and demand framework, which is fine. But typically what that framework starts with is that middle point, right, equilibrium. The notion of the market process, or the concept of the market process, is understanding how there are continual adjustments such that the economy is continually coordinating the actions of millions of different actors such that we're moving towards that equilibrium point. In other words, instead of assuming that we're already at that equilibrium point, what the Austrians focus on is the movement towards it, with the complete understanding that you never reach it and it's constantly changing. So what we assume is that there's individuals with diverse ends. We all want different things. We need to figure out how to coordinate our activities, given that we face scarcity constraints. And we need to figure out the different kind of institutional arrangements that allow us to do that. All right? And this is why Austrians emphasize the importance of private property, of prices, of profit and loss, and of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are at the heart of the market process precisely because they're continually alert to these profit opportunities. And what profit opportunities signal is that there's a better way to utilize resources. In other words, there's a better way to coordinate the use of resources and combine them that people value. And that value is then signified through profit. That's ultimately what profit and loss is. And that's why it's so crucial. So when people rail against profit and they say things like windfall profits or too much profit or too much wealth, really, there's one of two things. Either they don't understand economics or they do and they just don't like making their fellow man better off. Because ultimately the only way, of course, you can make profit, unless you take it from someone by force, is to provide them with a good or service that they value. That's it. There's only two ways to make money in the world. You either take it or you produce something in exchange for what others value. And of course, to engage in a voluntary exchange, by definition, the other party must perceive it to make them better off, or they wouldn't do it. It doesn't mean that, of course, after the fact they don't have ex post regret. They say, okay, I made a mistake. We all do that. We engage in exchange. And then you get home and you're like, I wish I hadn't bought this, or I didn't end up using this product. But at the moment of exchange, you perceive that it would make you better off. This, of course, is why after a voluntary exchange, both parties tend to say thank you, right? And we don't say that when someone does something mean to us, typically, or when they take things from us. So the market process is one where you have dispersed information, you have uncertainty, and you have human error, right? Humans are fallible. We make mistakes all the time. We also have different endowments of knowledge and skills, where each of us are better at some things and worse than others. The power of the market is that it allows each of us to take advantage of the skills of others, the intelligence of other people, and the mistakes of other people as well. Because of course, in a market system, losses are just as important as profits, because losses signal, just like profits signal that you have combined resources in a manner that people value, losses signal that you have combined resources in a manner that no one values, right? Or not enough people value at least. That's fundamentally what the market process is all about. And it's ongoing, it never stops. And oftentimes what appears to outsiders, right, because the market process in a sense is a spontaneous order, meaning it's a huge extended order of dispersed actions that no one outside of it can understand. It's not like you can have a bird's eye view like you could of a maze, for instance, and you could see a maze from above and figure out the way out of it. It's not like there's a market where you can hover above and observe the market and observe the layout of it and the complexity of it and then figure out what the mistakes are and tweak it to fix it. This is what Austrians emphasize. And this is fundamentally what the market process is all about. So that's the first step. The second step is the government process. So how does the government work? Well, the first thing we can identify is that governments are nonprofits. Right? That's the first thing to keep in mind. So that means that they act outside of profit and loss, which means they lose that crucial feedback mechanism that entrepreneurs in private settings face to determine if they are allocating resources to their highest valued use. Now, there's two aspects that have emerged in economics regarding government. One is the Austrian kind of line of critique, and one is public choice. And I'm sure you've heard of both of these, and I'll spend a few moments on each of them. So the Austrian one first. Austrians emphasize, as I mentioned, this idea of not dispersed knowledge and economic calculation. Okay, that's again why this profit and loss is so important. Government operates outside of profit and loss. Therefore, government cannot engage in economic calculation. Government has no way of knowing when it allocates resources if it's doing so in a manner that tends to be efficient. Now let me step back for a moment and talk about efficiency, because oftentimes people misunderstand this and they say, well, all economists care about is this notion of efficiency. You're cold-hearted, right? Why do you care about this? Well, there's a very simple reason we care about efficiency. If I can produce this bottle of water for $2, I don't want to spend $20 doing it. Why? Well, I can spend $2 having this bottle of water and then have $18 to spend on other things. In other words, I can be wealthier. I can have more total things. Typically in life, we like that. Not because we're materialistic or greedy, but we just like more as compared to less. Because we rather have, for instance, this bottle of water and $18 worth of health care, or $9 worth of health care and $9 worth of food, as compared to one bottle of water. That's what the notion of wealth is all about. It's increasing the amount of things that we value that we're able to acquire. That's basically why we care about efficiency. That's why we care about the fact that if people are combining resources in a manner that you and I don't value, they're penalized through losses. Because really what they're doing is combining resources in a manner that's wasteful, that you and I don't value as consumers. It doesn't contribute to our wealth. That's why we want them to be reallocated, precisely because we care about our fellow man. We want people to have more wealth as compared to less. This is why, again, any critique of profit that's earned privately through voluntary exchange, implicitly, at a minimum, if not explicitly, is a critique of increased wealth and making people better off. Remember, of course, when economists talk about wealth, we don't talk about just money. We mean things that people value. Could be leisure time, could be time with your family and friends, time with at church, if you belong to a church, anything at all that you value. So now we move to the government process. Government, because it's nonprofit, it operates outside the context of profit and loss, is unable to engage in economic calculation. Mises, in his book Bureaucracy, which was published in 1944, made this point explicit. He said, look, government bureaucracies cannot engage in economic calculation. Therefore, when they provide goods and services, there is no way for them to know if they are producing things that people value or if they are allocating them in an efficient manner. Now, you might say, well, elections, that's the way we know if they do it, if they're producing things in an efficient manner. Well, democratic politics, in other words, votes, is probably the worst possible way to determine if you're doing something correctly, and there's several reasons why. The first is, of course, that elections are held every several years typically. The second is one of the strength of preference of votes. In other words, if we all get one vote in this room, I can't gauge the strength of preference. You might vote for a certain political candidate, and I might vote for that same political candidate. But you might value them at $10 million, and I value them at $2, but we each get one vote. Right? Where in markets, we can express the magnitude of our preferences by spending more money, by bidding things away. I know that I value this iPad as compared to other people because I bought it for a price that they were unwilling to pay for it. I bid it away from them, basically. And that's ultimately, so you have voting only so often, the intensity of votes, but of course, you also have the problem of bundling of goods in politics. So I bought this iPad from Apple. I bought this iPad. I didn't buy this in my health insurance from Apple or my car. In other words, I bought one single good. In government, every time you vote, you're voting on a bundle of numerous goods. So there's no way to disentangle what your true preferences are. This is why most people have a pet issue that they're big on. It might be war, might be abortion, might be education, but they tend to pick candidates based on that, precisely because they know that there's no candidate that can possibly meet their preferences across the entire bundle of goods that government provides. This, of course, does not mean that government can't provide goods and services. They can tax people and produce lots of different things. We know that. We have lots of empirical evidence of that. What we can claim is that there's no way for them to know if they're producing the right amount of things. Now, you need to understand the radical implications of this point. For instance, the main one being that people typically say that government needs to provide what economists call public goods. Right? Public goods are goods that are non-rival versus non-excludable. Pure public goods, by definition, will be underprovided on the private market, precisely for those reasons, because they are non-rival versus non-excludable. So if they're underprovided on the market, you get what you call a market failure. The market fails to provide the optimal amount, and government must step in to produce it. Now here's the issue. How much does government produce? All right, now economists tend to talk about public goods as if they forget about marginal analysis, right? So marginal means additional. You need to make decisions on the margin. Do we provide an additional unit of water? Likewise, government has to decide, do I provide an additional unit of police, whatever that is. If it's a police officer or if it's an hour a police officer works, whatever the relevant unit is, that's the decision they have to make. Just like a business person decides on the margin. The issue is there's no feedback to determine how much they should provide. They don't know if they are providing too much or too little. In markets, we know this very easily. If a business produces too many cars, they start suffering losses. That means they should scale back production. There's no equivalent in government. So really what government ends up doing is guessing how much to produce. This is important because it is a strong critique of market failure arguments, or arguments against the market, that markets undersupply goods. Because notice what this entails. The implicit assumption is that there's some optimal amount that markets should be producing that they're not, and that government can step in and somehow fill that gap. But that assumes, of course, that government has the requisite knowledge to do that. And as the logic of the market process dictates, that knowledge is not given. It's not scientific knowledge that's out there. Well, people treat it like it's book knowledge that you can go to a library and pick up a book and flip it open, right, and find out how much to produce. But what Mises and Hayek argued and emphasized in their work, and then Israel Kirzner, who was one of Mises' students, what they emphasize is this knowledge emerges through the market process. It's not given, it's a result of people interacting together. So it's not out there to grasp, it's emergent. So there's no way for government to know how much to produce. And we have reason to assume that they overproduce things, right? Precisely because of politics, the way politics operates. Now here's what one of the important distinctions between Austrian economics and public choice economics is. Austrian economics assumed benevolence on the part of politicians. Okay, so what they assumed was, what Mises and Hayek during the calculation debate assumed was that politicians had imperfect knowledge, but they assumed they were benevolent. By that I mean they assumed that they really cared about other people. They weren't selfish. And the reason they assumed that was they wanted to grant their opponents the most charitable position possible. And what they tried to show was even if you had the most benevolent central planner, who truly, all they cared about was their fellow man. They had no agenda on their own. They didn't want things, to take resources for their family. It was, I care about you guys and you guys alone. They still couldn't successfully calculate in the economy. What public choice does is it switches that assumption over. They just typically assume that government officials have either perfect or near perfect knowledge, but that their motivations are different, that they're self-interested, and that's why you get screwed up outcomes. I should have explained a little more just to refresh your memory. So public choice as a discipline, this is distinct from Austrian economics, even though I'm going to kind of combine the two of them together, but they're separate subfields. Public choice economics emerged in the late 50s, early 60s, and basically what had happened was up until that point there was a romantic view of government. in economics. And the romantic view of government went something like this. Markets fail. There's lots of different market failures. There's the public good, is one I mentioned. There's externalities. So there's externalities that are not corrected in markets. There's inequality. There's business cycles. There's unemployment, these type of things. So there's market failures, and a benevolent government can step in to fix them. That's the romantic view of government. It's that government serves as a corrective. This was the dominant view in economics. And then what happened in the late 50s into the early 60s was that a group of scholars, which came out of the public finance tradition, started writing on these issues of applying the economic way of thinking to politics. And basically, here's what they said. They said, look, we assume that markets, actors are self-interested. In other words, they have ends they want to pursue. But for some reason, we're assuming that when they get elected, all of a sudden their nature changes. No longer are they self-interested, but now they're other regarding. They care about their fellow man. That assumption's incorrect. In other words, what we need is a symmetry of assumptions. If you're going to assume people have self-interested motives in the private market, when they're elected, they aren't transformed into saints. They're the same people. They respond to incentives and they have goals and agendas that they seek to accomplish. This revolutionized the way that economists thought about market failure, because the main implication was that just like markets can fail, so too can government now. And it's an issue of comparing the two. Which one is the greater failure? We can't just assume that markets fail and therefore government is superior. One of my professors at George Mason, Gordon Tullock, who's one of the founders of public choice, used to sum up public choice like this. And if you remember this simple kind of story, you'll never forget what public choice is. He says, imagine that there was a singing contest and there's two singers. And the first singer comes in and they're terrible, right? They're a terrible singer. So then you just award the contest to the second singer before they sing. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is it's possible that the second singer is even worse. Right? It's possible that the first singer was really bad, but the second one's even worse. Really, what is he getting at? Well, the first singer is the market. It's possible that the market fails compared to some ideal. But it's also possible that the government, the second singer, is even worse. And if you push aside that relevant comparison and just assume the latter, that the second singer is better, you can end up making a huge mistake. And that's what he was emphasizing. So that's the difference between Austrian economics and public choice, is these assumptions including knowledge and motivational assumptions. So basically the dynamics of interventionism emerges through the interaction of the market process and the government process. So in the market process, you have entrepreneurs who are constantly alert to profit opportunities. They're constantly alert to opportunities to buy low over here and either sell directly, arbitrage, for a higher price over here, or combine resources in a manner which they envision they then can sell for a profit. In government, you have bureaucrats who are unable to engage in that same logic, right? They're unable to engage in the logic of calculation that market entrepreneurs are. And it's a combination of those two things that leads to the dynamic of interventionism. You have politicians who are unable to engage in economic calculation, intervening in markets which they perceive that they can fix, they can make better, and then you have entrepreneurs who are responding to those interventions. Okay, I have this in here. This is what I was just saying. I forgot I had this slide in here. So public choice, as I mentioned, the assumption is one of perfect or near perfect knowledge, but self-interest. All right. Austrian political economy is, the knowledge assumption is one of partial ignorance, so you don't have knowledge of the specifics of the economy. This is the knowledge problem argument, but you assume benevolence on the part of politicians. Now, I should note very briefly that some people have read Hayek, Mises and Hayek, as being somehow naive because they made this assumption about benevolence. But this would be a wrong reading of both of them. As I mentioned, the reason they made this assumption was to give their opponents the most charitable interpretation. Right? So they said, look, we can show you that even under the best conditions of pure benevolence, you can't accomplish the ends that you have defined as the ends you claim you can accomplish. Now, we know that Hayek wasn't naive about this because in Road to Serfdom in 1944, he talked about what happens when politics replaced markets. In other words, when a dictator replaced the market mechanism. And in that book, he has a wonderful chapter. It's my favorite chapter in the book, called Why the Worst Get on Top. And it's a comparative advantage argument about dictators. And basically he said this. He said, look, what do dictators under central planning have to be willing to do? They have to feel comfortable telling other people what they should do. I have to tell you, no, you only can have shirts that are red, and everything else is banned, and you can't have cars. and you only can have this type of food, and you will work in these areas. In other words, I have to feel very comfortable dictating to other people how they should lead their lives. Also, he said it will tend to attract people who are thugs, because people that tend to like to coerce other people and impose things upon them are thugs, right? That's what we would call a thug. So what did he say? Well, the people that are going to tend to get on top in dictatorships are people that like to tell other people what to do and boss them around, and people that are willing to basically grasp at power at pretty much any cost. They're willing to stab their friends in the back. They're willing to climb over people in order to secure power so that they can impose their plan upon people. All right, so Hayek recognized this fully, this idea that when you opened up central planning, you had these unintended consequences. But during the calculation debate, they wanted to push these issues aside. And of course, we know, looking at the history of central planning, that in many, if not all cases, pretty much a brutal person eventually rose to the top. So here's basically the same thing, just in a different form to illustrate this to you. Again, public choice and Austrian economics, they fit together quite well, precisely because of these different assumptions, the knowledge assumption and the motive assumption. But they're distinctly different things, and the reason I keep emphasizing this is because the pure Austrian theory of the dynamics of interventionism does not make assumptions about the motivations of political actors. We don't make the public choice assumption. Now, we can after the fact, and if anything, it's going to strengthen the argument. Because again, what Mises and Hayek showed was even under the best conditions, you can't get the outcome you want, even under benevolence. So now when you start weakening the benevolence assumption, and you say, okay, maybe they're not benevolent, now the case gets even stronger, right? Because now you have people that can't engage in the relevant calculation to accomplish the ends they want, and they're thugs, right? So it's like the really worst case. They can't produce what they say they can anyway, and they're going to impose significant costs on ordinary citizens. Okay, so that's the key point to keep in mind here. The other thing I want to emphasize is that entrepreneurs in the market process do not react passively to interventions. And again, you realize this. Does anyone, so you get a shortage. Let's talk about rent controls, right? And maybe, I don't know how much detail your professors went into, or maybe you've learned this so long ago that you've forgotten it, but let's just talk about it for a moment. You get a rent control. You get a shortage. What happens? Who can tell me or has any idea what happens when there's a shortage in this case? So let's think about apartments in New York City. There's 10 apartments, they're rent controlled, and 20 people line up for them, right? Because the price is below. This is a shortage. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. How do you decide how to allocate the apartments? Anyone have any insights on that? You're a landlord, right? You own the rental property. What would you do?
My choice would be to raise the prices, and the people that are willing to pay more would...
Well, you can't, but by law, you can't raise the price. That's the rent control. So what would you do? You have 20 people lined up for 10 apartments. You can't legally raise the price. Random. You're a nice person.
Well, if you cannot raise the prices, maybe you can...
You're determining who to let live on your property. I don't believe you would do it randomly. I don't believe you'd close your eyes and just point to people. Well, let's think about some of the things you could do. You could illegally raise the price. So in New York, there's something called a key fee, right? Now, why would you charge people money for a key? Well, I'll tell you why you charge people money for a key or for a lock. It's like, well, you want a lock on your door, right? Well, you charge people money for a lock because you can't charge them direct rent, right? And so there's ways of circumventing this that is not charging them rent, but it's charging them for other things. Or they charge a maintenance fee, right? So they're basically just calling it something else. What else do they do? Well, when you have 20 people and you know you can rent it out, you only have 10 to fill, what else does this do? Well, it lowers the cost of discrimination on non-monetary margins, right? Which is something I like to point out to my students. The very goal, because of course, one of the reasons in the United States at least that we have minimum wage laws is to supposedly help minorities. But of course, minimum wage laws actually leads to discrimination. Because what happens is you get a shortage of positions available, you get excess demand, you have more people lined up, you can't discriminate based, everyone always discriminates by definition, by the way, right? Discrimination just means choice, right? So you're always discriminating by definition. If you couldn't discriminate, if someone asked you out on a date, you'd have to say yes, right? Or if someone had proposed marriage to you, you'd have to say yes. No one would say that you can't discriminate. We do it all the time, right? So we just don't like certain kinds of discrimination or perceived discrimination. So, but what happens? So you have 20 people, you have 10 apartment units. Now you can discriminate on race, you can discriminate based on gender, religion, right? Whether you like hanging out with the people, whether you're friends.
I was going to say, like, the preference.
Yeah, any preference you want, but it can't be monetary. You've removed that margin of discrimination. It lowers the cost of discriminating on non-monetary margins. And that's ultimately what happens. What else happens? Do you expect rent-controlled apartments to be updated and fancy or run down? Yeah, run down. Because if by law you can't recoup an investment, why would you ever invest money in it as an entrepreneur? You won't. So what tends to happen to rent-controlled apartments? They tend to be the worst apartments that are available, right? Oftentimes it's people that have lived in them since like 1970, and they still have like 1970 appliances and 1970 wallpaper, and they look terrible, right? What else do you get? You actually get, notice what happens. The argument is that you need rent controls because housing is too expensive. Well, one solution to this is building more housing. Well, what happens when you impose rent controls? You can't charge for housing. So you're going to invest more in housing or less? And the answer, of course, is less, because the return now is less because you've capped it, right? So entrepreneurs respond to all of these different things and more as well. So it's not just this immediate shortage that occurs. That's one thing. That does occur. I'm not denying that. But what the dynamics of intervention emphasizes is there's all these secondary, third, fourth, fifth, sixth effects that trickle throughout the economy, all linked back to that original intervention, which was attempted because we assume benevolence to actually help people, right? And that's what the dynamics of intervention is all about. It's that there's an intervention over here which is driven by the best of motivations. And that intervention, precisely because of this lack of knowledge, but also the inability of government to substitute for entrepreneurship because they can't engage in calculation, leads to a long chain of events, right? Oftentimes which people don't even realize that are happening, right? And there could be many others that you and I don't even realize, even in the few minutes we were just talking about it. So price ceiling's the example that I've given here. Credit expansion is something that, for those of you who have heard about the Austrian business cycle theory, I was talking about this in an earlier lunch seminar, but the Austrian business cycle theory is basically this idea that the the central bank injects money into the system in the attempt to either spur the economy or to lower the interest rate, typically to spur the economy in both cases. And that leads to a long chain of consequences where it distorts relative prices throughout the economy and leads to ultimately a bust. That's one example of the dynamics of interventionism. Again, you get an intervention over here which causes a chain of events throughout the economy. And here's the reason why. The reason why is because of relative prices. Remember, I told you that the relative prices between these two goods tell me something as an entrepreneur. It's not just like a price that fell from the sky, right? Very few people understand this point. I mean, I'm sure you all have friends and family members, I know I do, who like complain about gas prices all the time, or they'll say they're too high. And basically what they're saying is I don't like it, right? Because if you try to explain to them, well, no, really what that's capturing is the relative price, right? That relative to other goods, the scarcity of gasoline or the inputs into gasoline, they become more scarce. That's what that's signaling to you, right? And then people say, I don't like it. And they'll say, well, speculators or big oil or something like that, right, is out to get us. It's like, no, it's just relative prices. That's what's happening. Anyway, the reason that these unintended consequences, the chain of unintended consequences happens, not just the initial one of the shortage, but then the subsequent chain as well, is because relative prices have been distorted. When you put a price cap on something, it distorts relative prices. When you inject money into the system and it causes inflation, it distorts relative prices, right? Prices are not what they otherwise would have been on the unhampered market. And those prices on the unhampered market are communicating this knowledge of time and place that Hayek talked about. That's why it's so crucial. All right, so I want you to understand this point because it's a pure economic argument. There's no ideology mixed in here. Because one of the things, of course, that people often say is, well, Austrians are libertarians, right? They just like liberty, right? And a lot of them do, I'm not denying that. But the argument I'm putting forth here, the argument against government intervention, is not one based on natural rights or some violation of property rights. It's a fact that when government intervenes, it has real effects on economic activity which make people worse off, even though the initial intervention could have been motivated by the best of intentions. Again, I have not assumed any malevolence on the part of the political actors who designed and implemented this intervention. So what happens? You intervene, right? You get rent controls, or you get injections of money into the system. And some of these unintended consequences, right, the series, becomes evident. Okay, and then what happens? Well, you have two options at that point. You can either retract the initial intervention, that would basically undo it and result in an unhampered market, which would then reallocate resources, or you can intervene again, and you can then try to have another intervention which fixes the problems from the first intervention. Now, here's what Mises and Akita and Rothbard emphasized. As you can imagine, you intervene once, there's unintended consequences, then when you try to respond to one of the unintended consequences, that intervention also has subsequent unintended consequences, and the process continues. Now, politicians will, when they're deciding whether to remove the initial intervention or to subsequently intervene, what they'll do is they will weigh the costs and benefits like anything else. First of all, they have to be aware of the unintended consequence. Oftentimes they're not. And the second thing that they have to do is weigh the costs and benefits. Oftentimes the main cost of removing an intervention is the fact that there's vested interests now that benefit from that intervention being in place. So there's special interests that like having the regulation because they benefit from it. All right? Which is precisely why, like in the case of rent control, when they try to remove it, they always, the politicians always round up like some grandmother that's lived there since 1970, and she pays like $200 in rent in the middle of New York City when the apartment should be like $10,000 a month. And then they say, see, if you did this, you'll kick this old woman out and she'll be homeless and all this. And then people say, yeah, we can't do it. Now, here's the thing. Interventions have two effects. Okay, and I basically made this point already, but I want to make it clear. The first is the direct distortionary effects. All right, that's this. That's the shortage. That's the direct effect of a price control. Right, it's the immediate effect, the one you've all heard about, right, when you learn price controls. So that's the direct distortionary effect. The market's been distorted because there's a shortage. Okay, that otherwise wouldn't have been, because we know when prices are freely allowed to fluctuate, there's a tendency to remove all surpluses and shortages. Really what that's doing is coordinating people, right, which is the Austrian point. But the second is the indirect effect. All right, the indirect effect is this subsequent distortions I talked about. It's the distortions in the entrepreneurial process. Really what you're doing is you're preventing at all these different stages entrepreneurs from utilizing prices, the true price, what the price should be, to engage in economic calculation. This is what Israel Kirzner called the stifled discovery process. It's not that you ban entrepreneurs. It's not that you make it illegal. It's that profit opportunities that otherwise would have existed no longer exist in the case of rent controls. Right? This is what I was saying. Otherwise, they might have invested in more property because there's a higher rate of return. But precisely because there is no longer there's an artificially low rate of return, they won't invest in those projects. Likewise, under the Austrian business cycle, when the Fed, or the central bank, I should say, injects money into the system, it artificially lowers the interest rate, which sends a false signal to entrepreneurs that they should borrow more money. Because the interest rate, which is the price of borrowing funds in this case, the price of loanable funds, appears lower than it otherwise would have been. It's artificially low. When you distort prices in either direction, it sends false signals, not just indirectly, but then through all of the subsequent market exchanges throughout the economy as well. Right? The power of prices is that it puts in a common denominator all goods and services, so you can compare across all goods and services. That's the power of prices. That's why they're so important. They allow us to compare opportunity cost across the array of all goods and services. And the great part is, other than economists, no one needs to understand this. Right? No one sits down and draws supply and demand curves. But here's the cool part. You don't need to. You act as if you already understand this. The price rises, right? The price of gasoline in the United States rises. I know as a consumer I'm going to consume less of it. I don't know if underlying supply has shifted or demand has shifted. I also don't know where. Maybe something happened here in Guatemala that ultimately rippled through and caused the price change in Virginia, where I live. I don't know, but the nice part is I don't need to know. I don't even need to think about it. Prices already capture all of those movements and then aggregate it into a price, which then provides an incentive for me to change my behavior. The price increases, I consume less of it. Right? That's the law of demand. And that's the power of prices, and that's how it all flows together. You distort prices anywhere along that chain, you've distorted that ability to gauge in calculation. Right? That results in a misallocation of resources, which results in a misallocation of capital goods and consumer goods that flow into the structure of production. So now the question is, why do lots of interventions persist? Because the question that, the common question, just like anything, like when students say to me, well, you say free trade's so great, why don't we have free trade then, right? Or you can say, look, if it's true what you're saying that intervention makes people worse off, why do we have it? Okay, now there's two explanations for this. One is the public choice explanation, and this one I mentioned already, which is when you intervene, it creates interest groups, right? Who benefits from having rent controls? The people that get the apartments. They pay less. They're getting an apartment in New York City that otherwise would be thousands of dollars a month, and now it's hundreds, right? Farmers that get subsidies. They like that they get subsidies, right? So there's a vested interest group that has now an incentive to perpetuate that intervention into the future. And of course, the logic of politics is such that politicians tend to concentrate benefits on special interests and disperse the costs on citizens, right? So, for instance, agricultural subsidies. I don't know what the agricultural subsidies are like here in Guatemala, but in the United States we have agricultural subsidies, for instance, on milk production, right? Now, when I go buy milk at the store, this is the equivalent of pennies that I pay extra per gallon of milk, right? It's basically nothing. I don't even realize I'm paying it. It's embedded into the price. But of course, when you take my 3 pennies and your 3 pennies and we aggregate it over all milk purchasers and then we give it to a few farmers, they get a lot of money, right? Now, those 3 pennies, let's say I spend $8 a year throughout my entire year on paying more on milk than I otherwise would have. That's not enough to make me go stand and go lobby my representative in Washington, D.C. to remove my $8 basically in taxes that I'm paying. But when you aggregate all that up and you're getting millions upon millions upon millions of dollars as a milk producer, you do have a very strong incentive to lobby. And that's basically the logic of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. You concentrate benefits on well-organized groups, you disperse the costs upon the unorganized. That's the logic of special interest groups. That's the public choice explanation for the persistence of incentives. That's why we don't have free trade, right? Because you and I would benefit from free trade as consumers, but a relatively small amount, such that you and I don't have a large incentive to go lobby our representatives, whereby those industries that do benefit from those protections have a very strong incentive to go and do that, right? Which is the other reason that politics is a very weak way of disciplining politicians, what we call rational ignorance, which is you really don't know what the hell's going on most of the time, right? And I always give a quiz to my students. I call it the rational ignorance quiz. And it's not like I grade it, but I ask them, what your tuition is at the school. They all know if they're paying. If they're on scholarship, oftentimes they don't know because it's not in their interest to know. If they work, I ask them what their hourly wage is. They all know. I ask them how much a parking ticket on campus is for parking your car illegally. They know that. And then I say, look, how many of you know how much the United States gives in rice subsidies a year? And none of them know. But here's the shocking thing. A parking ticket on George Mason is anywhere from $15 to $50. In the scheme of the world, that's basically nothing. Their college tuition is anywhere, depending from a couple thousand, can be up to $20,000 a year. Again, for them it's a lot, but in the scheme of the world, that's a drop in the bucket. The amount of subsidies we give is like hundreds of millions of dollars. So the question is, why don't they know that? Why do they know a $15 parking ticket, but not a significantly more large sum of money? And the issue is it's not in their interest to know. Or they don't care about rice subsidies because they don't get them. And if you divide it by the number of voters in the United States, each voter pays $1 something a year, right? And that's the logic of rational ignorance. You're ignorant, but it's rational to be ignorant because the cost of acquiring that information is too high, precisely because the benefit you influencing the outcome is basically minuscule, right? And that's why democratic voting as a means of punishing politicians is an extremely poor way to do it. And of course, one thing I should have mentioned earlier is the biggest reason why democratic politics is a bad way to punish people is because the likelihood of you ever influencing the outcome is zero, right? The influence of you tying or swinging the election is zero, which means your vote doesn't count in terms of being decisive. It counts in terms of it being added on, just not in terms of swinging the outcome. So it's a very poor means of doing that. But the Austrians, when they developed the dynamics of interventionism, offered an alternative explanation for why interventions persist. Because remember, they want to keep the benevolence assumption. They don't want to make the self-interested assumption that I trade to a special interest group for your votes. That's the public choice one, right? Why do politicians give these handouts to special interest groups? Because they want votes in return, right? That's a self-interested argument. I'm giving you a handout in return for something. The Austrians want to push that assumption aside and make one of benevolence. So how do they explain this? Well, the way they explain it is one of the knowledge problem, which is when you intervene in a complex economy, it's near impossible to untangle the unintended consequences of that intervention from what would have happened in the market. In other words, what's the natural market process? How can you separate that out from the intervention? To go back to my example, how much housing would have been built absent the rent control? I don't know. It's a counterfactual that didn't happen, precisely because of the intervention. So you can't untangle what was caused by the intervention versus what wasn't. And it's that long chain of consequences and the inability of politicians to disentangle it, which makes it very difficult for them to realize that their intervention in many cases is causing these problems. In other words, imposing significant costs. So these are two different explanations. It doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong. They also could work together. You could have politicians who are genuinely ignorant. In other words, they suffer from the knowledge problem, and they're self-interested, right? This is why I say we combine the two together. In my view, when we combine the insights of Austrian political economy with the insights of public choice, you have a very strong case for being skeptical of government intervention. Because on the one hand, even if you assume benevolence, you have the knowledge problem. And then once you start easing the benevolence assumption and taking into account self-interest, now you kind of got like a double whammy. You got self-interested people who are going to do things to benefit themselves at the expense of the populace, and they suffer from the fundamental knowledge problem, which prevents them from engaging in the calculations they need to make to accomplish the desired tasks. So this is what I just said about the thing. So let me talk a moment about the paper. So you might say, well, how does that relate to the paper? Well, Maria and I were talking a little bit about it before. I just was rereading her version before. I hadn't read it in a while. This paper was something I wrote with two co-authors for a special issue of a journal on Austrian economics and economic sociology. And basically, here was what we were trying to do. We were trying to point out how government interventions, not into the market in this case, but into social settings, can distort social capital. So social capital is this concept that has emerged largely out of political science, public policy, but economists are paying more attention to it now. And basically, when we talk about social capital, different people have different definitions, but in the broadest sense, what we're talking about are the norms and the kind of beliefs that allow us to interact with each other. So you can think of things like trust, you can think of cultural norms, and other conventions which allow us to interact with other people. If you think about it, these norms are basically what drives most of our life. Okay? Most of our life is not things that are explicitly laid out in rules, but it's these informal norms and conventions that we interact with other people. Let me give you a perfect example here from my 3 days in Guatemala. With females in Guatemala, you give them a kiss on the cheek. Well, I didn't know this, so I didn't do it. And then, first of all, it led to some awkward moments where I was shaking everyone's hand. But in the United States, if you do that, you get slapped, which is why I didn't do it. I didn't want to get slapped. But now I'm picking up on it. So that's an example of local culture that unless you're in it or you observe other people do it, you don't realize that you should be doing that, right? Someone from Virginia, like myself, I wouldn't have known that that was the norm. And if someone had said that to me from the United States, I think they were trying to get me like slapped, so I wouldn't do it. If they said, yeah, you just gotta go around kissing people, I'd be like, no, I'm not gonna do that. So there's lots of different norms and trusts. Another example, think about this. You walk into stores, you pick up people's stuff, and you look at it. Sometimes you buy it, sometimes you put it down and walk out. Now imagine you walk into someone's home, which is their property, and start picking up their stuff and looking at it. And they're like, what are you doing? And you're like, yeah, I'm just thinking about buying this. I'm like, this is my house. Leave. We know norms, right? We know things that we can do. We know what violates social norms when you're in certain settings, right? We build trust relationships with people. There's people we trust in our life. There's family members, but there's also friendships, right? But then there's also a whole informal network we have as well. I'm sure you've all talked to people and a friend has put you in touch with a friend who's put you in touch with a friend. You've either gotten a job or you've made some connection through that. This is what the sociologist Mark Granovetter called the strength of weak ties. It's weak ties, right? These ties, it's not that you're best friends with everyone, but you know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and it's these ties that facilitate a lot of the things that we benefit from in life. So what we were trying to do in the paper is think about cases where government, or not necessarily cases, but we're trying to think of how it would look when government tries to intervene and kind of impose a structure on top of people, right? And of course, Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, she's written on this case where oftentimes governments go into other countries, oftentimes what are considered poor countries, with the goal of helping them develop. And they'll impose policies on them which are meant with the best of intentions, or at least people say they're meant with the best of intentions. And they'll literally move people around. They'll rearrange communities, and they'll rearrange groups of people because they think somehow that's preferable, right? It's going to help those people live a better life. But really what they end up doing in many cases is destroying these very norms and conventions that you and I benefit from on a daily basis. And they don't even realize they're doing it, precisely because they're outsiders, right? If I asked you to sit here and design a set of policies that would make people in Africa better off, you wouldn't be able to do it. Just like I wouldn't be able to sit in Virginia and know lots of things that go on here in Guatemala, right? Until I experienced it myself. And even that would take a very long time for me to integrate in and truly understand what was happening. And even then, I'd have a very limited sphere of knowledge of how to fix it. So what we're doing in the paper is talking about how, kind of the theory at least, and it's a short paper, but how government interventions to try to make people better off can lead to the destruction of social capital. The reason this is important is because most people in government tend to think of interventions as they're going to intervene, and if it fails, it's just, oh, we've lost money, so we've wasted some money, or we can even intervene more to fix it. But if you buy our argument in the paper, what can happen is that it can have other costs as well. It can destroy a lot of kind of the conventions and norms that allow us to function and operate. Now, what Maria and I had been discussing a little bit before the talk started was this idea that with any intervention, here's the tough part. In theory, an intervention can still make, on net, you better off, right? So you intervene, you don't know what would have happened absent it. In theory, if we did know, it's possible that the government intervention could make us better off, right? You could intervene, you could impose something on people, right, in a developing country, right? And then you can say, well, it made them better off compared to what could have happened if you had perfect knowledge, right? That's possible. The problem is we don't have perfect knowledge. So what we need to do, right, and this is what cost-benefit analysis attempts to do, by the way. Cost-benefit analysis tries to weigh the costs and benefits of a policy. And then when the benefits outweigh the costs, you do it. That's the logic behind it. The issue is that Austrians would raise is, can you ever really know what those costs and benefits are? And for public choice reasons, once you introduce the public choice issues, how confident are you that even if you can implement a plan that would make people better off, that it will actually get implemented in a manner that you desire? In other words, once politics starts getting involved, and then these interest groups start trying to manipulate it, you get rent-seeking, you get people trying to stick their hand into the pot of goodies that you're offering them, right, to secure it for themselves. How confident are you that the policy will actually be implemented in a desired manner? And every policy that you can think of, because the natural proclivity of people, whether it's citizens, you do this all the time, sure, I have the tendency to do it, politicians definitely do, is anytime something is perceived as being wrong, people's first tendency is to say, we must do something to fix it, right? We have to help these people, no matter what it is, we have to fix it. But there's big assumptions implied in that, right? The big assumptions are that you can, number one, imagine a preferable state of affairs, a better world, and number two, you can then design and implement the policy without having it distorted in a manner that actually generates that outcome. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at in this paper. I'm going to stop here. We can discuss anything you want related to this, if you have something you want to discuss, the paper or anything else that comes to mind. So does anyone have any comments or questions?
Do you have some examples like government intervention that bothers the social capital?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the paper we provide the example from India. And basically the example was one, this is during colonization, and the example is one where they imposed courts on them. This sounds like a good thing, right? Because on the face of it, it sounds like, okay, they don't have a modern court system, so we can impose it upon them. What we tried to point out in the paper is one of the effects of this was that it led to distortions in relationships that existed prior between people. So before having courts, of course, effective courts that people respect and utilize reduce transaction costs. That's kind of the economic lingo. But absent that, what people will do is invest in relationships. In other words, I'll build up a relationship with you so that I trust you and you trust me. So when you make me loans, for instance, you know that I'll repay you. And what had happened was, through these trust relationships, a kind of social insurance, a private social insurance system had emerged, whereby, let's say I was a farmer, right, and I borrowed from you on a repeated basis. But now I have a downturn. There's bad weather, or I have a bad harvest, and I can't repay you by the due date. And I come to you and say, look, I I apologize, because of this I can't repay you. Well, what would happen is it would be like a close friend saying this to you, and because of repeated dealings, oftentimes you would give me a break, right? Knowing that we would repeat in the future, that I would pay you back in the future, but then I'd continue to give you business and so on. And what happened is when the courts were imposed, what happened is the market opened up. Now, in most cases, we'd say that's a good thing. There was more competition, more access. But what happens then is that I couldn't be confident. You couldn't be confident anymore that I would come back to you, because now I had lots of other potential lenders. So what happened is when there was downturns in the market because of bad weather, because of other factors, you would no longer give me a break. You would use the courts to then take my property. And this led to a backlash and led to a breakdown in the community norms. And we have a couple quotes in the paper, I believe, from actual reports in Britain after these riots broke out, talking about how the courts had basically destroyed these local norms. What happens is, a lot of times with interventions, and we all have a tendency to do it because we have something, I believe in psychology, it's called like the self-humanizing bias, where we view ourselves as somehow better than other groups of people. Like the way we do things is better than how other people do it. It's a natural tendency in human beings. Basically, I think the explanation is something that gives you confidence that you're doing the right thing and that you're living well. But here's the downside of that. If you think you're better than people, right, that your way of life is better, you also believe that imposing your way on life of people can be better, or that they'll, not just imposing it's better, but that they'll somehow like it, right? That, well, we do it this way and it's good, and therefore you must do it that way too, and it'll be good for you. This is pretty much what underpins most development policy in the world, if you really think about it at a deep level, right? It's the assumption that a group of people in Washington, D.C., at the IMF, at the World Bank, somehow they know what's best for people in these other societies, precisely because what they experience on a daily basis and they observe that other people don't is somehow bad, and that they can fix it, right? I was talking to, I forget his name, but a gentleman who was here last night. I gave a talk on development, and it was very funny because he came up to me after and he's like, yeah, one time, so he lives here, and he said, one time I was trying to pick up a German girl, and I was talking to her, and I asked her what she thought of Guatemalans. And she said that I felt pity for them because they were poor and they didn't have what we had. And I said, okay, that's kind of weird to say. And I said, well, did you end up hooking up with her? No, I didn't ask him that. I should have, though, in hindsight. If I see him again, I should, because of pity. That's the view, right? It's one of pity. And in some sense, the United States government, precisely because we have wealth, they view themselves in this role all the time. It's what's called in political science American exceptionalism. They view that the American way of life is somehow superior, so that it's not just a lot of people in America make the argument that Americans have, this is what the second George Bush, this is a lot of the logic he used. Not only do we have a responsibility to help others, we have a moral duty to not just help people, but to like show them the right way to live, right? Which is like our way to live. Which is really in an arrogant position if you think about it. In any other walk of life, if you went around and acted like this towards people, no one would want to interact with you, right? Because they'd be like, oh, there's the obnoxious guy that's always telling me what to do, right? But I like doing what I do. It's how I live my life. But that's kind of the view behind this. So the problem is with this kind of argument that I'm making about the social capital is because it's counterfactual, because you don't know what would have happened, it's very hard to say that the people are worse off. What we fall back on is the idea that because of the limited knowledge that government officials face, especially when they start moving further and further away, not geographically necessarily, but just the knowledge distance, right? Because even in the United States we have this among the Native American Indians, right? So we have lots of guilt. So what happens? Well, the US government, because they feel so guilty, created reservations for them. And they give them tons of aid that's supposed to help them. Well, really what happens? The exact same stuff I just talked about, right? Indian reservations have the highest level of unemployment in the United States. They have the lowest level of education, highest level of welfare recipients. And it's like the classic example of this. And that's within our own borders, right? And so it's not a geographic distance thing, because we can walk there and look at them, right? And talk to them. It's a knowledge distance. It's a issue of understanding the local knowledge and how things operate, right? And it persists precisely because it's politically incorrect to say anything opposite, right? So if you go around the United States, someone like myself, and you said, well, this is bad, you're actually making them worse off, that's considered politically incorrect, and somehow I'm being like a bad person. But all I'm being is an economist. I'm just talking about incentives, right? It's not like I want harm to befall upon them. It's just the reality of it. And it's the same kind of logic, but just broader. We see this kind of stuff all the time, these unintended consequences. So, in Afghanistan, we toppled the Taliban government, the United States, along with Britain and some other countries, but mainly the United States. And now we went in there to help rebuild. But, I was talking about this last night. A report just got released by the World Bank that 97% of the GDP in Afghanistan is dependent on US aid now. So now the argument saying that we can't leave Afghanistan, because of course, there's promises made by politicians that we would leave, but they've been broken before. But now the argument we can't leave is they're dependent on us, right? And basically they're dependent on handouts from the United States. So you've got this whole set of subsidiary problems. And basically anytime you intervene in a complex system that you can't possibly understand, you're going to get these kind of repercussions. Again, this doesn't mean that you should never intervene, because we can't make that claim. It means that we should be humble, I think. That's I think, the strongest claim we can make. I can't make the claim with certainty, again, that we should never ever intervene. It can never generate it can never generate benefits. It's that we need to be skeptical and at least ask about think about some of the unintended consequences. And the way it is now, policymakers rarely, if ever, talk about even potential unintended consequences. They just assume that they're smart enough to fix it, and that people want them to fix it. So with the Canada example, it was just an example. In Canada, there's laws about language that you have to have on signs. So we just use that as an example early on. Those people might like it, but I think I think all cultural protectionism is very odd. I think it's a very odd thing, because it treats culture like it's some kind of static stock that can't change. And of course, cultures have changed. It's weird because a lot of people, so when I teach students, a lot of them will say, they're like anti-McDonald's, anti-Walmart, and they'll say globalization, you homogenize, you ruin people's cultures, right? This is the kind of arguments they make. It's an odd set of arguments for a few reasons. One of it's the point I just raised about this arrogant position. I mean, think about how arrogant that argument is. The simple response to this is, okay, if people want to protect their culture, why don't we let them choose? And here's the thing. McDonald's can open a McDonald's, and then you can say, I'm repulsed by that because I don't like it, I don't like the golden arches, it's ugly, it's ruining my culture, and I'm not going to purchase it. But instead what we say is, in the name of protecting the culture, I'm going to dictate that you can't have it. Right? That's a very obnoxious position. It's basically like treating certain groups of people like they're kind of in a museum, and they need to be protected and isolated to be viewed by the outsiders. I mean, imagine any other walk of life where you said, you can't go to college because I liked you when you were kind of like ignorant and innocent, right? We'd say, no, that's very rude and arrogant, right? But we do it all the time with this type of thing. If people want to protect their culture, in the case of language, they can just speak in that language and refuse to speak to people in another language. I try to speak to you in English and you ignore me, you refuse to interact with me. You're welcome to do that. We can't interact then, that's the cost, but you can do that. So that's what we were trying to get at with that example, just to illustrate it. And then the Indian example is the one we were trying to point out. Now, colonization's an example of some of this stuff, but there's an open debate on whether colonization was good or bad. Right? We know in certain cases it was very bad. But some people make the argument, for instance, in India, that it had positive effects with building infrastructure and things along those lines. Maybe, maybe not. Those are open for debate. But we know that there was a cost to it.
I know what you spoke about the symmetry of assumptions that public choice proposed. You spoke mostly about the self-interest assumption, but the perfect knowledge assumption hasn't turned into an imperfect knowledge yet self-interest explanation of why these interventions get maintained. I've heard about public choice in cases such as Lynn Ostrom's or Vincent Ostrom's that assume imperfect knowledge, but mostly applied to cases such as communal resources management. Has it applied to government?
The perfect knowledge assumption?
The imperfect knowledge yet self-interest.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I do it all the time. I mean, people make these arguments all the time. The reason I made the distinction is just to, in your heads, I wanted you to categorically realize that there were two separate lines of argument. They're two distinct lines of argument. One's focused on knowledge and one on the motivations. They're two separate things. But we can combine them, and we should combine them, because they're both right. right? And the reality of politics is that they're self-interested politicians who have their own agendas and respond to incentives created by political institutions, and they lack the knowledge to engage in economic calculation. So it was purely a categorical distinction I was making, but we should combine them for every policy. So for the rest of your life, no matter what walk of life you're in, anytime you read a newspaper, every time you hear people talk, politicians, if you're in politics or government, these are the two things you need to think of. Do people have the appropriate, and even if you run a business, do people have the appropriate incentives to do what you want them to do? That's the first question. And do they have the relevant knowledge? Right? Because if you run a business, for instance, let's say you ran a business and it was very successful and it got very big, right? You'd face these same kind of issues internally to the firm. If you're kind of the CEO, you're the director of the firm, and you run a very dictatorial firm, you have to make every decision. You're going to face issues because you're up here and your firm is huge now. Let's say you have 10,000 employees. There's lots of people that are down here that have very specific information that can make your business better. But if you're hell-bent on making every decision because you like to be in charge and you like to have control, you're going to miss out on all this local knowledge. So what you'll have to do is figure out ways to provide the appropriate incentives for the people that have the useful knowledge to utilize it correctly. So these issues pervade every part of life. It's just you got to figure out how to utilize them correctly. So yeah, embrace public choice and embrace Austrian economics. Public choice came out of the Chicago School of Economics largely, right? Which is not opposite Austrian economics is too strong of a claim. There's different assumptions made, right, about the efficiency of markets and about the information that's available, right? Because of course, remember that this equilibrium kind of framework came out of that same way of thinking, right? That there's an equilibrium that's out there, that markets are hyper efficient, right? That there's these quick movements to it. The Austrians take a much more, I would say, humble and also realistic view of markets, which is they're groping markets. They're imperfect. People have to figure things out. People make mistakes constantly, but that's all right. And that's the kind of world, that's what we have to realize, right? Is that precisely because we're humans and we make those mistakes, that's why we need to embrace markets and not politics, because politics is people that make mistakes too, but they don't have those feedback mechanisms, right? And that's the thing to think about. Now, the Ostroms have also talked about how to design different government institutions, which is a whole other question to try to make them as efficient as possible. It's the whole TBU argument, for those of you who have heard of it, like competition between governments, voting with your feet and things like that to try to make governments more responsive. It sounds nice. I think that has its own set of problems, but there's that strand of public choice as well, which is then how do you design, given, if you believe, and some people disagree with this, but if you believe we need a government, the question then is how do you best design it, given the issues we've talked about? And that's a whole nother set of problems.
Is there a limit, like a limit on a line to say intervention is good if it is focused on this area and it is not good if this in this area?
Well, we can't, as economists at least, I don't think we can say that. We can't delineate that line. No matter what area you relate, what you apply to, the same problems exist, right? So the people would say, I think, that the role of politics is to decide how you should what role government should have, right? So people engage in voting and they determine government, they vote for someone and then they get education spending, for instance, or healthcare spending, right? But what I would point out is that no matter what we're talking about, healthcare, that's the other thing we need to always remember as economists, is that a good is a good is a good, right? Healthcare is no different than this iPad, which is no different than this water. Of course, they're different goods and people value them differently, but analytically, we treat them the same, right? So the reason I say this is because oftentimes in the United States, I'm sure you know that healthcare has been our big thing lately. And when you try to have discussions about this, people take it very personally, right? And they'll allow emotion to replace clear thinking. So if you say to them, well, healthcare is not free, just because you say there's no cost to it, it's not free. We still need to figure out how to allocate resources, right? There's scarce healthcare resources. It's marginal. It's not a homogeneous lump that falls down from the sky. What do I mean by this? Do you offer people Band-Aids for free? Do you offer people CAT scans for free, right? What medical services do you offer? Then, of course, there's still queuing costs, meaning people line up, right? There's still the cost of waiting. That's a way of sorting people. That's a price people pay. It's not a monetary price, but it's still a non-monetary price. If I have a hangnail, are you going to treat that? And do I come before or after a cancer patient? These are all issues we need to work out, right? Which means someone has to make decisions about how to allocate scarce resources. So we need to think about all of these things using the tools of economics and the dynamics of interventionism, which means we can't make a delineation about it being a good or bad intervention ex ante. James Buchanan made the distinction like this. It's conceptual, but he talked about it like this. There's basically three kinds of roles the state can play. There's a protective state. The protective state basically protects our property rights and enforces the rules. So they don't do anything. It's kind of like the referee in a sports game, right? In a soccer match, the referee doesn't run around and kick the ball. That would be intervening in the economy. They enforce the rules, right, that have been established. Then there's the productive state, and conceptually that's the state that contributes things like productive public goods that contribute to wealth. Now again, the issue is of determining those public goods, but again, it's conceptual. The third is the predatory state. That's the state that takes stuff from people. He says, look, we want to design rules to avoid the predatory state, because that's when you start getting bad outcomes, precisely because the government, the soccer referee has started kicking the ball around, basically, right, influencing outcomes. And that's a lot of how things operate. I think sports analogies are always a good way to think about this. I mean, imagine if you had two soccer teams, one was much better than the other, and so the referee started intervening in the name of social justice, right? And they said, look, it's unfair that they're faster, they're better, so I'm going to handicap them, right, by help them, right? I mean, most people would kind of be offended by this, and they think that it wasn't the game anymore. But people are very comfortable making these claims all the time in other walks of life. And so I think that's a good way of thinking through it. But you know, that's ultimately what you have to think about when it comes to these policy issues, is the dynamics of interventionism. In the United States, for instance, with healthcare, it's very fun. Well, it's not funny. It's sad, but it's funny to see this logic play out, because what happens is the government puts forth these forecasts, but they're completely made up. So it assumes a future growth rate and future costs, and they say, see, we're going to save all this money. But now what's happening is when it gets implemented in 2014, all these people are saying they're going to opt out. So what happened is employers are forced to provide health care to employees. And if they don't, they have to pay a fine. So it's going to be cost benefit. They'll provide it as long as it's cheaper than the fine. But when the fine becomes more expensive, they're not going to provide it. So I just saw a survey the other day, like something like 30% of employers are just going to drop coverage altogether and pay the fine to the government. And then government's going to have to provide health care to all these people, which means what? Well, taxpayers are going to have to provide health care to all these people. And then we're going to have a whole new round. And I imagine what's going to happen, this is my prediction, I don't know for sure, a new law will be passed which forces employers to give it. And that's kind of so we can see this playing out where there's one intervention, it leads to unintended consequences, a chain of events, then they're going to come in with another intervention, and really what you're going to get is this, this long chain of consequences, because you're intervening in a very complex system. Same thing with the housing market and the other interventions that are going on right now in the United States. It's the same kind of logic you can see at play. And it just continues. And people just continue to intervene because they keep seeing these unintended consequences and they want to keep intervening repeatedly. It's very bad from an economic standpoint of allocating resources efficiently.
One more, sorry. Do we have a good example of social intervention, something that went just well?
That went well? I mean, sure. This is part of it. You can say that. Here's an example, one example that people use all the time in the United States, and it always gets brought up to me. They say, well, without the government, we wouldn't have highways in the United States, and the highways have generated a lot of wealth. See, so therefore it can work. Well, that doesn't show it can work. That shows that we can build lots of highways. Now, I don't deny that I like having highways. I like being able to drive from California to New Jersey across the entire state. I like it. But there was a cost associated with that, right? And we don't know if actually those resources could have been used for something better. Now, it generated wealth because it allowed for interstate trucking. I don't deny that. And people would say it worked well. But we have lots of examples in the United States of massive public work projects that have gone awry. The classic case, of course, the most recently is something in Boston called the Big Dig. The Big Dig was supposed to revolutionize transportation in Boston. And they built this huge tunnel. It was supposed to make all traffic efficient. It ended up taking 15 years. They ended up cutting it short. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The tunnel's leaky, doesn't work, traffic's worse than ever, and we just go on. All right? Now here's the thing. I imagine this. I imagine public work projects in like Africa as like lots of little big digs. right? There's lots of wasted resources. There are lots of failed projects. The difference is people in Boston, in Massachusetts, they can afford government failures precisely because we're so wealthy. So we can afford lots of stupidity like that. So there's interventions that work from that standpoint. People would say, they point out lots of cases. People would say, for instance, that having welfare, if you ask the average citizen, I'm sure they'd say having the welfare system in the United States is a good thing. You know, I brought up the Native Americans. I'm sure people would say, yeah, giving them AIDS is a good thing, right? And so a lot of it depends on what you mean by has it worked. By people saying they like it, from that standpoint it's worked. But from a purely economic standpoint, one of efficiency, it's unclear that it's worked. And we can't make that claim. But that's why we need markets, precisely because of that. So I think the way to think about this is, if you buy the dynamics of interventionism logic, what I've pointed out, what we want to try to do is stretch markets as far as we can, right? And now there's a debate over how far you can stretch markets, to what extent markets can provide goods and services, right? So of course, I don't have a great understanding of the education system here in Guatemala, but when you raise the idea of private education in the United States, people get oftentimes people get offended by it, and they'll say, well, you can't leave that to profit, right? You can't allow markets to do this. You can't allow profit and loss because it's the kids, right? And you have to, you can't leave kids to profit and loss. Of course, our response, economists' response to this is very straightforward, which is in every other walk of life, all the good stuff we have is because of profit and loss, right? I have this iPad not because someone was nice and gave it to me, but because I paid money for it, right? I rewarded them precisely because they did it. It seems that's that place precisely where we'd want to put our kids, right? In the hands of someone that was competing for our dollars. In the cases where we have central planning, the United States Post Office, for instance, the DMV that handles our driving licenses, those are typically the cases where we get the worst customer service and the least amount of innovation. So the U.S. Post Office, has hemorrhaged, right? It's suffering huge losses every year. And they keep doing these things where they raise postal rates. They keep raising the rates. And they keep trying to make these adjustments. They keep claiming every year you hear politicians say, we're going to run it like a business now. But it's not a business, right? It's a government entity. Yeah, which means it's not a government business. And for some reason, and we have UPS, we have FedEx, right? For some reason, those things, which are, by the way, banned from first-class mail, from mailing envelopes in your mailbox, there's a law against that. The government has a monopoly on it. They somehow profit repeatedly, and they stay in business without any kind of government subsidies. By the way, an interesting story about FedEx. The founder of FedEx wrote the business plan for that company as an undergraduate at Yale University for one of his management classes, and he got a C on it. The professor wrote something like, this is not feasible, the idea that you can mail packages around the world in a day, that's silly, right? Because the post office can't do it, how would you do it, right? And, that's a perfect example of entrepreneurship, right? So someone in a college class came up with it, and I always use this as an example. I have the exact quote in a presentation I give on entrepreneurship, and it's the perfect, Fred Smith, I think, is the CEO's name, because even the professors at Yale, people that we would consider some of the smartest people in the world, don't know entrepreneurial opportunities when they see them. Fortunately, he didn't listen to his professor, right? Because if he did, people would have been worse off, because FedEx serves a lot of people. There's many other examples of that as well.
Tocqueville, for example, in Democracy in America, makes a case about the tradition, that's what we would call informal institutions nowadays, and the importance of how governments are supposed to reflect that, in the sense that, for example, Americans in the 18th century were apt for a democratic system, whereas if you went to a Frenchman, he would have preferred the government to intervene and take care of a lot of his services, probably more in the sense of a productive sort of government, as we can almost say. What do you think of opt-in mechanisms nowadays? Because
what kind of mechanisms?
Opt-in, in the sense that if you were supposed to, say, free cities, create a space where people should come in and take advantage of a new kind of norms, it wouldn't be missing the link between that kind of norms and informal institutions. But at the same time, it wouldn't be imposing them.
Right.
And a lot of the objections that kind of projects has gotten is it wouldn't last, because people are not ready for a kind of government that would allow them to take care of that kind of opportunities.
So Tocqueville's actually fascinating in Democracy in America. So that's basically his recordings of his observations throughout his travels of America. And one of the things that he marveled at and talked about in that book is the idea he said, look, people in America have a unique ability, habit, I think he called it, for self-governance. Right? And what he was marveling at was this idea that people came together in these community groups, what we would call civil society today, not like the government form of civil society, but real private organizations to solve problems. And the reason he thought this was so important is because the fact that private individuals could come together and solve things, he called it self-interest rightly understood. Right? So it wasn't pure self-interest and greed, it was my self-interest involves my fellow members of my community also being made better off. So I'll help them out when something happens, my neighbor, because I know they'll reciprocate. That's self-interest rightly understood. It's in my self-interest to further my community as well. And so that's what he was kind of pointing out. And I think we've lost that in the United States to a large extent, largely to the extent, for the reason you're saying, is that people have become very dependent on the state. Paternalism, state as a parent, right? So then we come across, well, how do we resolve this? And I haven't studied all this stuff on the charter city, so I've read articles, and I know they're thinking about setting one up in Honduras, if I understand correctly. I'm skeptical for two reasons. I hope they work, by the way. It's not like I don't want them to work, but I'm skeptical for two reasons. The first is I think it was the point you were raising, which is I'm not sure the actual people, a lot of it will depend on their kind of culture and beliefs. Do they have this, what Tocqueville called this habit or this ability to engage in self-governance? The second is I don't trust government. And here's kind of my parallel in my head, and I hope I'm wrong. In the United States, there's something, I don't know how familiar you are with it, called the voucher movement in education. All right? And here was the thing. So there's pure private markets and there's public education. Those are kind of two extremes. Well, we have public education, as I was saying, people are say, well, you can't have private education, you can't allow the market to do it. So people came up with this scheme to kind of keep public education. Milton Friedman talked about this all the time, by the way. To keep public education, but introduce competition. It's a voucher. And so the idea was, and right now the way it works is you're born into an area, and you're in a district, and that's the school you go to. Right? So if you're stuck in a crappy district, the only way out is to move. Okay? Of course, you can imagine poor people with the least ability to move are the ones that get stuck in the worst spots. Wealthy people can move to wealthy districts, and they get the best schools. Right? So the whole idea that public education was supposed to serve as this great equalizer, no. Right? So, and of course, wealthy people can then afford to pay taxes for public schools and send their kids to private schools anyway. So the voucher system was this. Instead of saying you're tied to your district, each family would get a voucher. And it would be for a certain amount of money. And then parents would decide where to send their child to what public school, and they would hand the voucher to the public school. So you could be born in District A over here and it has a really bad public school. And what you do is you get in your car and drive your kid to school B every day, and that's your school you give them because it's better, and you give them their voucher. The idea being that the bad schools, public schools, would go out of business because nobody would send their kid there, and they'd get no vouchers. And then the schools could then take that voucher and turn it into the government to get the money. That was the idea behind it. They've tried to implement these in several instances, and they've failed to be implemented. All right, and here's the reason why. Every time they try to implement them, the teachers union tries to block it, and they start putting in all these regulations, right? And so they distort the whole thing. And then what happens is the results come back, and they're either the same or worse than the public schools. And everyone says, see, markets don't work in education because we tried it and it didn't work, right? Again, that's not what you and I would consider a market in education. We consider that a very distorted market, right? So in some sense, I'm anti-vouchers. Not because I don't believe in markets, but because I believe that trying to mix complete public monopolization, I mean, it's a nationalized school system, right? So it's socialism over our public education system. With markets, is going to lead to very perverse outcomes, and then markets get blamed, right? Even though it's not markets, it's the public system that should be being blamed for this. And that's why I'm skeptical. I worry, for instance, this happens. Let's say we set up a charter system in Honduras. Okay, so we set up a small charter system and it starts to be really successful. I guarantee, unless somehow you establish really binding constraints, that the government's going to start intervening somehow, right? And then if it does badly, you're going to say, see, charter cities don't work, freedom doesn't work, right? We need the government. And then they're going to start railing against that, right? And that's my concern. I don't trust embedding private freedoms like that or testing private freedoms within a broader public system. Now, that said, I realize that that might be the reality we face. That might be the best we can do. Right? We had this discussion a little bit last night related to this. I was talking about development. And one of the things I was talking about is free trade agreements, because someone was telling me about, and I still don't understand completely, but about some of the labor laws going on here in Guatemala, and how I guess the U.S. government's forcing certain labor laws in under the free trade agreements, right? And I was saying, look, we don't need free trade agreements. It's not like you walk into a store and you sit down with the person's lawyer before you buy, this water and work out a free trade agreement. You hand them money and they hand it to you. That's free trade, right? So why the hell do we need a free trade agreement that looks like this? Well, I'll tell you why. Politics. Free trade agreements are nothing more than just the attempt to basically, under the guise of free trade, have for special interest groups to manipulate outcomes in their favor, right? That's what a free trade agreement is. And the reason I don't like them is because it basically bastardizes free trade, because you're calling something free trade that's not. And one of the participants was saying, well, look, that might be the best we can get. And if it made people better off, even though we had these labor laws, would you want it? And I said, look, ideally I wouldn't want it. I want people to realize that free trade is free trade, and you don't need government to negotiate that for you, right? I mean, it's like, okay, it's very, yeah. I mean, it's very easy. I don't know. The U.S. government should just say, citizens in Guatemala, citizens in country X, pick it, are allowed to trade with citizens in country in America. That would be a free trade agreement, right? And just like I can walk into any store in America and purchase something, right? That's what I want. Would I pick that if that was the only alternative? Maybe, but I still want to fight for that ideal, and I think we can get there. And maybe that makes me an optimist or unrealistic. But I worry that when we go to these kind of measures, we're going to get kind of a mixed, screwed up system, and then we'll never actually pursue, the end that we want, or we'll get discounted. That said, I'm very curious because I think it's going to happen somewhere. So I'm actually quite curious to see what happens with it. There's this other thing too, the seasteading thing with Patri Friedman, where it's, you go live out in international waters on a boat. But I'm very skeptical of that as well. I mean, I like the idea somewhat. Someone told me they were setting up a medical boat where you can fly out and get surgeries. I like that idea, so you can do experimental medicines because it's not regulated. But I don't know, have any of you been on a cruise ship? Have you taken a cruise? I like it, but I like it for like a week. I wouldn't want to live on it because it's like the extent of the market. Like, I wouldn't want to live just with all of you, right? Not that I'm against you, but I like the fact that we can also go out into the world and we can still interact in this room. It's not like we can't talk to each other. But I also can go trade with lots of other people as well.
Yeah, well, I have some doubts because I heard Patrick speaking with Russ Roberts on an Econ Talk episode, and he was making the case that this sort of cruise ships, they're actually like platforms, like oil platforms. Are going to be operating within the governmental systems as if they were just one more business, like getting to the coast of the United States for a while and then leaving for like a couple of weeks, and it will have to multiply a lot before it can actually be like a country.
Right. I mean, cruise ships are in some sense the bastion of freedom because they typically register in places with low taxes and low labor laws. It's so funny because when I go on cruise ships, I'm always fascinated how they operate as an economist, just because I'm amazed. For instance, even if you look at the amount of eggs provided on a cruise ship, it's something like thousands of eggs are prepared. I find this fascinating that they're there every morning and they know exactly what to do, and they get there and multiply it by every food they prepare. So I always ask a lot of questions. Well, you get seated with a couple at your table. You get seated with other people at your dinner table. And I remember the people I was with, they were from somewhere in the South in America, but they were talking to the waiter and they were complaining because the way it works for the waiters is on cruise ships, they come from relatively poor areas and they don't get a wage. They don't get a wage paid by the cruise ship. It's all tips. And they go for 6-month stints, and they live like 4 people to a room. So if you've ever been on a cruise ship, it's a very small room, right? And so they're away from their families, and for like 6 months at a time, and they get these tips, which is the equivalent of a couple $100s a week, all right? And so the people at our table were saying, like, this is terrible, they're exploiting them. And I'm like, no, they're not, because what I said was, of course, the natural question is, what's your opportunity cost, right? Because, of course, the natural proclivity of people in developed countries is to compare it to us, right? So we say, like, our per capita GDP is this, or we have these labor laws, therefore it's bad, right? But that's not the opportunity cost. And it turns out, guess what the opportunity cost is? Making like half that, Right, so I was talking to the waiter on the last one. He's like, you know, I realize I'm away from my kids, but I'm going to be able to send my kids to school. They're not going to have to work, you know, and they'll have an education, and they'll be able to have a better life than I am. And so I said to him, like, you know, obviously through demonstrated preference, he prefers being on the cruise ship. Now, if I offered him Bill Gates' job, I'm sure he'd choose that. But that's not the option, right? It's either this or working in some factory or something equivalent wherever, I forget what country he was from. Something, yeah, but making significantly less. So from his standpoint, given those options, this was a way to increase the wealth of his family, but also to make his children better off as well. And it's that way of thinking where people are like, that's terrible, they're taking advantage of you, you know, we should pass laws that ban this, that makes people worse off because you're restricting their choice set.
Plus you're imposing your
values on them. Yeah. I mean, we always want to, especially for people that are worse off, okay, if you want to measure it in income, however you want to measure it, the thing we want to do is increase the amount of choices they have. Precisely because they have fewer choices, right? So, and the more choices, the better. And choice means you can opt out. That's what a choice is by definition. If I stick a gun to your head and tell you to do something, that's not a choice, right? A choice is saying yes or no. So there's all these debates, because people say like, well, he didn't really have a choice, someone like that, because he had to do it, because his family would be poor at it. Well, he did have a choice. It may not be as many choices as I've had in life, but I don't have a lot of choices either, right? For instance, I'd like to work at Harvard, but Harvard won't hire me, right? And they haven't called, and I keep waiting, and they won't call, right? So my choice set's constrained as well. Am I being exploited or taken advantage of? No, not at all. I have other choices, right? And in academics, right? Or I could go work in private industry, or I could move to a different country. I have options. Everyone does. Some people have more options than others, but what we want, and this is what Hayek talked about in the Constitution of Liberty, is expanding the choice set people have. That's what having a better life is all about. Having more choices as compared to less. And I don't have kids, but if you have kids, that's how parents tend to talk about their children. I want my children to have a better life than I do. And what do they mean when they say that? They want them to have more options. That's really what they're talking about. And that's ultimately how a lot of people tend to think about living a better life. And that's ultimately, it requires outsiders, whether it's the government or people outside, leaving you alone and not restricting your choice set. My good friend Ben Powell, he was here a couple weeks ago he's a professor, was here for a Liberty Fund. He's writing a book right now on sweatshops. He gets in these debates with people all the time, and people, they get very cruel to him about this stuff. I mean, they get very mean about it. But he makes these arguments. I think actually when he was down here, he spent an extra week talking to some people in some factories. I don't know where exactly. Yeah, he gets into these debates about sweatshops, because of course in the United States and in other developed countries there's a huge movement to boycott them. So you shouldn't buy clothes from places, or you know, sneakers or athletic equipment. And of course what that does then is shut down the factories, right? And the argument is, well, we need higher labor standards and higher environmental standards. I mean, it's ridiculous if you think, especially the environmental standards, right? I mean, on the face of it, you can understand the labor standards. If someone's in a crappy factory, you want to make them better off. So you can at least understand where they're coming from. But the environmental standards, you know, we're like, we want to impose carbon caps and what they can cut, what trees they can cut down. I feel very fortunate that I've never been in this position. But if I was destitute, the last thing I'd care about is cutting down a tree. Right? I'd cut it down in 2 seconds and set up a fire so I could cook some food or keep myself warm. So when people are like, no, we have to tell people, you know, they have to do this or not do that with the environment, it always strikes me as extremely odd. Of course, in the United States, we didn't care about the environment until recently. Like during the Industrial Revolution, no one was concerned about the environment. We care about it now because we're wealthy enough to sit around and think about like what kind of things can we intervene in now, right? That's literally what happens because we get so wealthy. We're like, boy, what else can we do to tell other people what to do?
Even in the environmental meetings, the U.S. is the biggest pollutant in the world, and you're the one that's saying, oh, everybody else does this, but I'm not doing it.
I mean, that is true. We like to do that.
Okay, whatever.
We like big cars.
Yeah, exactly.
We like stuff like that.
You like big everything.
Yeah, yeah. It is amazing, and I never realized it until I went to spend time in Europe, actually. Because I'll never forget the first time I was in Europe, I ordered Coke and they brought me Coke, and it was like what I would consider like a shot glass. I'm like, no, that's a good sip, you know, I would like, you know, the rest. But they view like what they normally serve would be like huge for them. So it was a very, you know, I got to spend a summer in Romania in graduate school for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. And it was such a shocking experience for me. Not culturally, well, culturally too, but not just culturally, but you know, you go out into the villages and you see how devastating central planning is on these people's lives. Because of course, under the Ceausescu regime, families were at first allowed no private property, but then when starvation set in, they were allowed to have one small plot, but just for personal consumption. You couldn't trade with your neighbors, so no trading allowed, but you could just like eat your tomatoes and stuff. And you go into these villages years after, you know, that regime collapsed, and these families still, you know, have their garden and their donkey, and that's what they have. Roads aren't paved. The electricity's turned off at like 9 o'clock at night because the power grid just can't keep up. The water gets shut off. And you really realize how devastating these efforts at central planning were, you know? And then I got to go to Ceausescu's palaces. You know, he had multiple palaces, and they were some of the most beautiful places I've ever been. You know, gold-plated faucets, and I mean, it was just brutal. Just brutal. I felt, you know, and of course now the U.S. is, and other countries with Romania and the other post-communist countries, they tried to help them develop, right? And then you kind of, because development's just central planning with a new name. That's really what it is, just different people doing the planning, the Western experts. I'm writing a book right now on humanitarian aid and how these efforts to help people, right? So humanitarian aid can either be after a natural disaster or because of starvation, but how these efforts to go in and help these countries just have the opposite effect. And it's not like I have any great insight. A lot of it's just applying these basic economic arguments to it and how these efforts to help people actually lead to the worst and make them worse off in many cases. And there's numerous examples of this.
No, but if you even only see the humanitarian, to compare the Japan earthquake with the Haiti earthquake, we were talking about that the other day, saying that the Japan earthquake, you see people helping. The Haitians just lay there waiting for you to resolve their life. I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Well, that's what they're used to.
Yeah.
Because the United States has given Haiti so much money for years, and so you have this aid dependency issue. But the more interesting point with the earthquakes, by the way, the easiest way to insulate yourself against you can't avoid natural disasters. The plates of the earth move, it's going to cause earthquakes. We have them in the United States. Every country, well, not every country, but many countries have them. Yeah, right. So that's not an issue of, you know, earthquakes don't discriminate against people. The easiest way to insulate, or the best way, given that you can't avoid it, is wealth, right? And this is what I thought originally you were going to say. If you look at the number of deaths in Haiti, Japan, and Chile, with the earthquakes, it's actually amazing, right? And without even controlling for the magnitude of the earthquake, because the one in Haiti was actually weaker than the other two in terms of on the Richter scale. The absolute number of people, yeah, because look, it's very simple. I'd rather be in this building during an earthquake than like in a lean-to, right? Because things are going to, you know, collapse. Buildings are sturdier. Now, you know, have you heard of Naomi Klein? Anyone heard of Naomi Klein? The Shock Doctrine is her book. She's a socialist from Canada. And her book's called The Shock Doctrine, and she basically blames capitalism and Milton Friedman and Hayek for like all the problems of the world. And her argument, the shock doctrine, is as follows. These crises occur in the world, and then the greedy capitalists use it as a chance to impose their system on people that exploit them. All right? So after the earthquake in Chile happened, and this was after the one in Haiti, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal saying, like, you know, Chile should thank Milton Friedman, because Milton Friedman, of course, went to Chile and even though, you know, they had a dictator, but he still said you have to free up the economy. This is the way you're going to get wealth, which he gets flack for talking to a dictator, but we'll put that aside for a moment. Well, this article said, you know, they should thank Milton Friedman because of the wealth. You know, they are wealthier, they did it. And of course, Naomi Klein came back and said, no, it was the state, because the state had, you know, the socialist state imposed strict building codes, and that's the reason why. Well, the obvious response to this is they do have building codes that are imposed by the government in Chile. But the response to this is you can impose the most stringent building codes you want, right? Unless you're wealthy enough to afford the materials to meet them, buildings don't get built, right? In Haiti, you could have the most stringent building codes in the world. You'd still be like in a mud hut or whatever, because that's what they can afford, because they're dirt poor. You know, and it's obvious why they're dirt poor, not because they're Haitians, but because for centuries they have lived under brutal governments, either ones that have emerged indigenously or ones that have been imposed from outside. I remember the United States intervened in the early 1990s to restore their government, which was a brutal dictator, right? But he was a friend of the United States, so we went in to intervene with our military to help them, right? And then we act surprised when they're poor, right? So it's, It's kind of sad, but I think the best you can do is keep this stuff in mind. So, should we call it good? Well, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure. I wish you all best of luck in your studies. And if I can ever be of help, let me know.